When the English novelist Anthony Trollope returned to London in 1872, after a year and a half in Australia, he was indignant at what he saw. Commercial interests ruled the capital of the British Empire, fueled by reckless financial speculation and careless credit. People were obsessed with social standing. Relationships were only a means of climbing the ladder. In Trollope's view, this was an altogether unseemly specter. In response, Trollope wrote a satirical novel titled The Way We Live Now. At more than 1,000 pages, it's the longest of his 40-plus novels and arguably the most derisive. In his autobiography, Trollope explains why he wrote the novel. He says, "A certain class of dishonesty magnificent in its proportions and climbing into high places, has become at the same time so rampant and so splendid that there seems to be reason for fearing that men and women will be taught that to feel that dishonesty, if it can become splendid, will cease to be abominable. If dishonesty can live in a gorgeous palace with pictures on all its walls and gems in all its cupboards, with marble and ivory in all its corners, and can give Epicurean dinners and get into Parliament and deal in millions, then dishonesty is not disgraceful, and the man dishonest after such a fashion is not a low scoundrel. Instigated, I say, by some such reflections as these, I sat down in my new house to write The Way We Live Now." While some of the moneyed scoundrels in Trollope's tale eventually get their comeuppance, the story of London remained a tale of two cities, as Charles Dickens had described it a decade or so earlier. Of course, Trollope had his own shortcomings. His unseemly anti-Semitism undercuts the moral authority he wields against the duplicity of his day. Even so, the travesties of his day remind us of the travesties of our own. Here in the U.S., we too have seen dishonesty of magnificent proportions climb into high places. As a result, we too have seen dishonesty cease to be dishonorable or disgraceful, at least to many Americans. I was reminded of Trollope's novel by a recent column in the Washington Post by Karen Tumulty, the associate editor of the newspaper. It's part of the series in which Washington Post opinion writers describe the biggest issues on their beats for 2024. For her part, Tumulty focuses on the widespread use of the statement, "This is not who we are." She points out that we have heard these words countless times over the past decade. Most notably, we have heard them from Joe Biden in response to Trump's harshest policies at the U.S.-Mexican border, and from Biden after the deadly 2017 white supremacist march in Charlottesville. We have heard them from Republicans who refused to stand up against the MAGA movement and then tried to distance themselves from it. We heard them from Kevin McCarthy in the wake of the attack by Trump supporters on the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021, when McCarthy said, "This is not what our country should look like. This is not who we are." Tumulty concludes her column by saying, "If Americans, knowing everything they now know about him, re-elect Trump or come close to doing so, it will be time for us all to quit lying to ourselves. This is who we are." As we approach our congregation's 205th annual meeting later today, which will be my final annual meeting as your senior minister, I wish to address the question of who we are now in religious terms, who we are as a nation and as a congregation. I have two primary conclusions I wish to share with you. The first is that All Souls has never in its history faced greater challenges than it does today. All Souls has found itself in financial or architectural peril numerous times over the past 2 decades. Indeed, our first 3 sanctuaries, variously located in the southern third of Manhattan, were eventually abandoned because of shoddy construction or inadequate upkeep. But each time the congregation rallied and together found a way to begin again, as we have done more recently in renovating this magnificent sanctuary. Today, I believe All Souls faces daunting challenges on 2 fronts. Societal challenges that have disrupted the historic role of religious institutions, and long-standing dynamics within the congregation that make adapting to these changes difficult. The societal changes, which began almost imperceptibly half a century ago and continue to develop slowly, have been accelerated by the COVID crisis. 2 years ago, as schools, workplaces, and houses of worship reopened after the COVID lockdown, The Economist magazine published an article titled, "The World's Religions Face a Post-Pandemic Reckoning." The article begins, "Ask a vicar, a rabbi, or an imam about the biggest challenge facing his or her congregation, and the need to foster spiritual values in a secular world may leap off the tongue. Yet the world's religions face an equally acute but different sort of problem: how to stay in business in the material, competitive sense." The article goes on to point out that economists have long analyzed religious groups as if they were businesses. In 1776, Adam Smith argued in his influential treatise, The Wealth of Nations, that churches are enterprises like butchers, bakers, and brewers. In a free and competitive market where they rely on donations and volunteers to make ends meet, Smith said, clergy must act with zeal and industry to fill their pews. Mergers, acquisitions, and bankruptcies are inevitable. COVID has helped sort out the winners and losers, The Economist observes. Congregations that were effectively catering to the needs of their flock before the pandemic have often thrived, while those that were already struggling have found it even harder to retain their congregations. Some struggling congregations have closed their doors permanently. Others have merged, and still others have sold off their real estate assets to survive. It's a time of reckoning for religious institutions, The Economy concludes. The virus has certainly made godly institutions take stock of their commercial as well as their spiritual assets. For my part, I believe we fit into the category of congregations that were catering effectively to the needs of our members and friends before the pandemic. We swiftly and adroitly pivoted to a virtual sanctuary as the pandemic spread. As a result, we have managed to thrive both spiritually and financially. Even so, the reckoning has come to congregations like ours as well. Why? Because a longer-term reckoning has been decades in the making. Religious participation in the U.S. has declined by about 1% per year since the 1960s, and the rate has accelerated over the past 15 years. As a result, 30% of the congregations in the U.S. are expected to close their doors permanently in the next 20 years. Corresponding to this decline in religious participation, the percentage of the population that is religiously unaffiliated, the nones, has risen from 5% to 30%, and analysts expect this percentage to continue to rise in the future. Here's the silver lining in this extremely bleak forecast. While nearly 1/3 of the people in the U.S. aren't religiously affiliated, they aren't necessarily hostile to religion. In a new report issued 2 weeks ago by the Pew Research Center, researchers say that recent surveys reveal that most nones have a nuanced view of spirituality and religion. The overwhelming majority of nones say that religion causes division and intolerance, and it encourages superstition and illogical thinking. Yet 58% of nones also say that religion helps society by giving people meaning and purpose. If you do the math, this means that there are more than 80 million U.S. adults who are not religiously affiliated, yet believe religion helps society by giving people meaning and purpose. In the years ahead, many of these individuals will be looking for sources of meaning and purpose for themselves. And I believe many of them will be open to spiritual communities that have adapted to the needs and realities of the day. When I came to All Souls 30 years ago, our new members came primarily from people who had left traditional communities of faith, mostly Jewish, Protestant, and Catholic. They were looking for a community of faith that had less of certain things, less focus on doctrine and dogma, less loyalty to ancient scriptures, less insistence that believers follow a certain spiritual practice. All Souls was a perfect spiritual home for many of these come-outers. We had less of everything. Today, the situation is dramatically different. Most of the people who walk through our sanctuary doors for the first time are spiritual seekers. They are looking for more of something, more ways to be part of a caring community, more emphasis on spiritual practice, more theological guidance on what to believe, more ethical guidance on how to live. The future does not belong to those individuals and congregations who want to recreate the past. It belongs to those who are willing to embrace the realities of the present and address the uncertainties of the future. It belongs to those who base their plans and programs on who we are now. During the years I spent at the University of Chicago doing my PhD, I often walked past the University of Chicago laboratory schools. For more than a century, these elementary and secondary schools have been at the forefront of educational research and innovation. They are fully functioning schools, among the best in the nation, but they are also laboratories where current practices can be assessed and new approaches can be tested. As I have said on previous occasions, my hope is that All Souls will increasingly become a laboratory congregation, where conventional attitudes about religion are challenged, current practices are examined and assessed, and new approaches are tried and tested. No one knows what patterns of spiritual practice and what forms of religious community will be emotionally satisfying and morally instructive in the decades ahead. Given the challenges and uncertainties, laboratory congregations will be more likely to thrive than those that merely stay the course. We've already demonstrated that All Souls has the capacity to innovate. We've gone into the laboratory when we had to, as when we transitioned to our virtual sanctuary during COVID. We've also gone into the laboratory when we sensed an opportunity, as when Pamela Patton launched our highly successful Buddhist and mindfulness program. In the years ahead, All Souls will need to spend increasing time in the laboratory. Which brings me to the internal challenges I believe All Souls faces today. Long-standing dynamics within the congregation that make adapting to societal changes difficult. All Souls has a strong tradition of believing that this congregation sets the standard. And in some ways, it does. But if you listen to our congregational conversations, we also have a tradition of thinking that we know best, and what happens elsewhere doesn't apply here. What constitutes best practices often gets short shrift. If All Souls is to thrive in the decades ahead, this attitude of exceptionalism will need to change. Other internal dynamics often complicate leadership and threaten to thwart progress, such as loyalty to an outmoded form of governance and the use of rumor and other forms of disinformation to exert influence. I believe these dynamics pose a significant challenge, including a significant financial challenge, to the ability of All Souls to address current needs and adapt to future changes. I will address these internal dynamics further in my senior minister's report at our annual meeting later today. While I believe All Souls faces greater challenges today than ever before, I also believe All Souls faces greater opportunities than ever before. The need for spiritual community, spiritual guidance, and moral clarity in our nation has never been greater. The opportunity for All Souls to become an ever brighter beacon of inspiration and hope has never been greater. I believe deeply in what All Souls stands for, and I also believe in its future. My focus today has mostly been on the challenges around us and within. But despite these challenges, this remains an extraordinary congregation with an extraordinary history. For my part, I'm deeply grateful for the privilege of serving as your minister. I've invested my entire professional career thus far in this community of faith, and I continually strive to be the best moral and spiritual leader that I can be. I'm proud of what we have accomplished over the years, especially the lives that have been transformed during our time together, the most enduring legacy of our ministry to each other. It is my hope and prayer that the best days of All Souls lie ahead of us. If in the future historians look back and say, we laid the groundwork for the flourishing of All Souls during an era of deep spiritual need, I will say our efforts together have been successful. Thank you, I love you, and may all that is divine bless each of you and this congregation we love so deeply. Amen.